Yes, thank you indeed. So I claimed earlier on that I could do this in 8 minutes, so that is what I'm going to try to do. OK, so we've just been talking about citizen science and how it's difficult to define, and I agree with that. But for the purposes of what I'm going to talk about today, I think there are a couple of broad categories that it falls into. So at one level, you have people contributing data. So they may be interacting with the environment, looking for trees, counting insects, telling us about their health. And then on the other side, you have projects where people help with data analysis or curation. So, for example, we can see here Galaxy Zoo, I'm sure many people are familiar with, which asks people to classify galaxies. And in the bottom right corner here, we have an application which asks people to classify fossils. And this is the one that I'm going to be talking about today. So, from a research perspective, what is this talk about? Really, we were interested in examining the impact of the registration process on online citizen science. So, the research question is, should people be required to register before they can contribute to a study? And the short answer, for those people who want coffee now, is no, but they should have the option. So, Reading Nature's Library is the name of the application that we were working on. We produced this in collaboration with Manchester Museum, who have a fossil collection of around 100,000 items. And these fossils are sitting in boxes at the moment. So, obviously, you can't display all of them at once. But the really big problem with this is that about half of them, about 50,000, aren't catalogued. So unless you know where those fossils are and you know of their existence, then you can't use them for any of your scientific interests. So to try to rectify this situation, Manchester Museum have been photographing the fossils. So you can see here the fossils with the label next to them, which describes various things about the fossil, such as where it comes from, who collected it, where it was found, what type it is, and so on. And they came to us and said, well, do you think we could catalogue these through crowdsourcing? So we put together an application, which you can see here. You've got the photograph of the fossil, and underneath you've got a web form where you fill in the information that you can see on the label. So the square, which you may be able to make out in the middle, looks like an artifact. It's actually a magnifying glass. So some of these labels, obviously, the writing is very small, so we have a magnifier there. So it's very straightforward. So when we set up the platform, so we designed this, we co-designed it with both curators and people who are interested in paleontology and who would be interested in contributing to this task. The one thing we couldn't really answer was whether or not we should ask people to register. So we thought we'd take an empirical approach to trying to tackle this issue. So of course there are pros associated with registering. It allows people to keep track of their work. It means that we can communicate with our citizen scientists. And it also means that we can use gamification potentially to motivate people. So we can use things like leaderboards. And so we know that this is motivation for some people. However, it's not motivation for everyone. And a lot of people don't want to compete and actually find that off-putting. And crucially for us, I think, we were really worried that the effort involved, this is a new project, people hadn't seen it before, the effort involved in registering in order to take part really might be a barrier to people making any contribution. So to test this, we created 2 versions of the application. So the first one you can see here is the landing page for a condition where people were required to register. So the pink button in the middle asks people to sign up if they want to take part, and then there's a login button as well for those who've already got an account. And if people want to sign up, then they complete this form here. So it's pretty lightweight, but it's still another screen that you have to go through before you get to the application, which is here. For people in the condition where they weren't required to register, they landed here straight away. So in both cases, the first time people came to the app, there was a brief training period, which explained the task. But otherwise, they went to the app and they were able to get stuck in straight away. You were allowed to register, though. So even if you weren't in the condition where the registration was mandatory, you had the option to do that. So you could do that either straight away or you could do it within a session to save any points that you had within that session. So the study design followed an A/B testing approach. We conducted it in the wild with the live project, and we assigned people who were visiting the site to a condition at random, and we tracked them with a cookie containing an identifier. We divided people into 3 groups. So the first group A is where registration was mandatory. In group B, registration was optional, and in group C, which we felt was useful to distinguish for analysis purposes, were people who were initially assigned to B, but then chose to register. We publicised the project via various social media channels, and we collected data for 6 weeks. So when it came to the analysis, we had 2 hypotheses. The first was that people allocated to the condition where registration was optional, which is group B, are more likely to make at least 1 contribution. So they're more likely to make any contribution. And our second hypothesis was that people who registered, so this is group A where it was mandatory and C where it was optional, would make a greater number of contributions on average. So we hypothesised that having made a commitment to the project, again there's some evidence for this from other work, people would be more likely to make a larger number of contributions. So what did we find? Well, we found that whilst 8% of Group A, the mandatory registration group, contributed, 13% of Group B did. And hypothesis, so we say hypothesis 1 was supported. But crucially here, there was no difference in data quality. So we selected a sample at random and checked manually the quality of the data, and it was very high throughout. There were no differences between the groups. So here you can see the distribution of the number of contributions made by individuals in each group, and the distribution will be familiar to any citizen science people here, the long tail. So even though in Group C it looks like we've got some really high contributors there, in fact the average number of contributions made by people in these 3 groups was not significantly different. It was quite similar. So we reject hypothesis 2 in this particular situation. One other thing that's worth mentioning, I think, is in Group C, this was 30% of the people who contributed in Group B. So a third, just under a third of those people chose to register. And half of these people registered before making any contribution. So they registered straight away. So they saw the link and they logged in before they actually started making any contributions. These are small numbers of individuals we're talking about, and it's not possible to really draw any strong conclusions from this, but we thought it was quite interesting that some people were choosing to do that. So what did we learn in this particular project? Well, obviously, the take-home message is that registration should be optional. And, of course, this is a format that many online citizen science projects already follow. So I think the contribution here, from our perspective, is that we've quantified the additional contributions that you could get by ensuring that registration is optional. So in our case, the contribution rates were around 60% higher. Which, of course, if you scale that up, can make a really big difference to the number of entries that you have to your platform. And we also found that data quality wasn't affected. And this project is still going on now, and this is still the case. So we're still finding these patterns within our data. So I think I've just about done it. And I'll say thank you very much, and I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Hi, Dan Buzzer, University of the West of England. I don't know whether I missed it at the beginning. Did you see any or track bounce rate before either contribution, where people would come and be dissuaded from registering at all, whether you're actually getting a filtering at that point?
Right, so that's an interesting question. So I don't have the figures for bounce rates with me. This was certainly something that we looked at. So I think for most people, if they chose, there were kind of a subset of people who sort of came back about 3 or 4 times before they actually decided to dive in. I couldn't tell you the precise proportions of that, but I think it was higher with Group B than it was with Group A. So I think a lot of Group A sort of got to the registration page and were sort of like, right, no, I'm kind of, whereas, so they were bounced immediately, whereas with Group B, we had a number of people who kind of came back and looked at the application and didn't do anything that time, but maybe the third time they looked that they would make a contribution at that point. But I would have to check those figures to be completely sure. It's a very interesting question, though.
So let's give another round.